Hey guys, in this video we're going to be talking about characteristics of exponential graphs. And as you can see, we have an exponential function over here, g of x, and we're going to be labeling this graph using these seven characteristics on the left. So let's get started. We're going to be working backwards. So let's start with the end behavior. So the end behavior, remember, is defining the graph as x approaches negative infinity and positive infinity. What is y doing is our question. So as x approaches, and we're going to use an arrow symbol, let's start with the negative infinity. As x approaches negative infinity, y is, or in this case it would be g of x, since that is our function, g of x is approaching, we could just put an arrow, it's approaching, so when looking at this side of the graph, the negative x side, we see that the y functions are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And you see this dashed line, which indicates that there's an asymptote. So all these points are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, but they're trying to approach 0, which is our answer, but they never really touch 0. So since they're getting smaller and smaller and smaller to 0, the y values are approaching 0. Or let me just write it out. 0. On the positive x direction side, so as x approaches positive infinity, the y values for function g approach, since they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger, the arrow goes up, we know that's approaching positive infinity. So that is our end behavior for g of x. Next, we're asked to define the equation of the asymptote. So we have our asymptote right over here, this dashed line, and it's at 0, particularly y equals 0. Because when we're asked to find equation, we have to make sure we include the equal sign. That's very important. Now, let's look at our next one, the third characteristic, which is the y-intercept. Y-intercept is where x is 0. So x is 0 on the graph at this point right here, and that is 1. So the y value is 1. So it's 0, 1. Next, our range. So we're talking about the y values. In this graph, we can see that, let's start from the bottom, the values kind of start at 0, but they don't touch 0, so we're going to use a parentheses, comma, and they go all the way up to infinity, positive infinity. Do I always have to write the positive sign? Is a question I usually get. No, but it's kind of nice to say, just to put it there because it shows that you know what you're talking about. Domain, we're talking about the x values when we're talking about domain. So let's look at the x values then. So on this side, they're going to continue on to negative infinity, but the y values are getting smaller. And this side, even though they're going up, they are moving a little bit to the left each time. To the right each time. So we know that this side of the graph is also going towards infinity. So we have negative infinity, comma, positive infinity for the domain. Now for the equation and growth factor, we're gonna take a pause from this graph and come down here where it says parent function for exponential graphs. Remember, parent functions are your base, or they kind of define the function, and then you can start adding transformations to it. So in this graph right here, we see that our parent function is f of x equals 2 to the x. So the power is x. And And we have our values 0, 1 on the table, 1, 2, and then 2, 4. So those are our three standard values that are given. We can get more, but we don't really need them. So it's important to realize that at point 1, our y value is 2. So we're going to create a small table for this graph. So x and y. And we can just have three values, 0, 1, maybe 2. So when it's 0, when x is 0, we can look at the graph. So when x is 0, right here, y is 1. So it's the same as the parent function. But when x is 1, our y value here is 3. So we're going to have 3 on the y. When it's 2, we can't really see because the graph's cut off, but it's 9. But we don't really need this, and I'll tell you why. So since we can see that the 0 value for the x when x is 0, the y value is 1, they have the same y-intercept, we know there's no horizontal or vertical transformations. So we can rule that out. So we just have a number for this equation. We have some number raised to x. And to figure out what number that is, and that's pretty easy. So all we're going to do is look at our x where the y is when it's 1. So here, when it's 1, it's 2. And that's why we have a 2 here. So when I come back up here, I see that when x is 1, my y value is 3. So this hashtag or this number that goes over here is going to be 3. So 3 to the x. And that's all we need. So that is our equation. So g of x equals 3 to the x. And our growth factor is from 1, what number do we hit? So like from 0 to 1, we go from 1 times what number? So 1 times x equals 3. And x equals 3. So our growth factor is also 3.